The sound of rolling suitcases echoed through the busy airport. People hurried in every direction, some rushing to catch their flights, others waiting in long lines. Among them walked a tall black man, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that seemed to shine under the bright airport lights. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not needing to speak much because his presence already commanded respect. His name was Mr. Johnson, and while many passengers saw only a well-dressed traveler, few knew the truth about him. He was not just a passenger, he was the CEO of the very airline they were about to fly on. But for now, he walked calmly, unnoticed, with a boarding pass in hand. When he reached the gate, the airline staff smiled warmly at him. They knew who he was, but he preferred not to make a scene. He enjoyed moving through the world quietly, blending in with others. With a polite nod, he handed over his ticket and stepped onto the jet bridge. The sound of footsteps tapping against the floor as he approached the entrance of the plane. Inside the aircraft, the cabin smelled faintly of fresh leather and coffee. Flight attendants greeted passengers with polite smiles. Mr. Johnson found his seat in the first-class section, a spacious chair with soft cushions and extra legroom. It was the kind of seat that promised comfort for the long journey ahead. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down and loosened his tie slightly, finally allowing himself to relax. The hum of the engines in the distance was almost calming. As passengers continued to board, Mr. Johnson opened a book from his briefcase. He enjoyed reading during flights, using the quiet hours in the sky to think and plan. Around him, other first-class travelers settled into their seats. Some glanced at him curiously. He noticed the looks but ignored them. It wasn't the first time strangers questioned his place in spaces like this, and sadly, he knew it wouldn't be the last. The line of boarding passengers seemed endless. A stream of people walking down the aisle, looking for their seats. Then she appeared. A white woman in her early 40s wearing an expensive coat and sunglasses, walked into the cabin with an air of superiority. She scanned the rows, her eyes sharp and calculating until they landed on Mr. Johnson. Her gaze hardened. Her lips pressed into a thin line as if she had seen something that did not belong. Slowly, she began walking toward him. Mr. Johnson kept reading, unaware at first of her focus on him. She stopped beside his seat, and for a moment, the cabin grew a little quieter, as though passengers nearby sensed what was about to unfold. She tilted her head, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and insult. Finally, she spoke, her voice dripping with irritation. "You must be in the wrong seat," she said, pointing at him with a manicured finger. "This is first class." Mr. Johnson looked up from his book. His calm brown eyes met her sharp ones, but he said nothing at first. He simply studied her, giving her a chance to correct herself. But she did not. She crossed her arms, waiting, as if she were a teacher scolding a child. He closed his book gently and placed it on the small table beside him. "This is my seat," he said in a steady, polite voice. "You must be mistaken." The woman gave a short, cold laugh. "I don't think so," she replied loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This seat belongs to me. People like you don't usually fly first class." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others pretended not to hear. The flight attendants, still helping people find their places, glanced nervously in their direction. Mr. Johnson stayed calm. His face revealed no anger, no frustration. He had dealt with moments like this before, though each time left a small scar. The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice but keeping her tone sharp. "Why don't you just move to the back where you belong? Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her words hung in the air like poison. Mr. Johnson adjusted his cufflinks, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. Instead, he sat taller in his seat, his calmness a silent shield against her hostility. Nearby, a man cleared his throat, as though wanting to speak up but stopping himself. Another passenger shook her head in quiet disbelief. The tension was heavy, pressing against everyone in the cabin. Mr. Johnson finally reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. He held it out for her to see. "This is seat 2A, he said, his voice still calm. "And as you can see, that is my name on the ticket." The woman's eyes darted to the boarding pass, then back to him. For a brief second, her confidence faltered. But pride kept her from backing down. She straightened her shoulders and said coldly, "Well, we'll just see about that when the flight attendant comes." And with that, she turned sharply. waving her hand in the air to signal one of the attendants. The cabin was silent, waiting. Passengers leaned slightly forward, sensing that this was only the beginning of something larger. Mr. Johnson returned the boarding pass to his pocket and picked up his book again, his calm demeanor unshaken. He knew how this would end. What the woman didn't know was that she wasn't just questioning a fellow passenger, she was questioning the very man who owned the airline she was flying on. And soon she was about to find out. The flight attendant hurried over with a polite smile, trying to keep the peace. The white woman waved her hand dramatically, pointing straight at Mr. Johnson as if she had caught a thief. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice sharp enough for the whole cabin to hear. "This man is sitting in my seat. He doesn't belong here." The attendant blinked in surprise. She looked at Mr. Johnson, then at the woman, then back again. For a second she seemed confused, but only because of how sure the woman sounded. Mr. Johnson stayed calm, his hands resting on the armrests of his seat. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he quietly pulled out his boarding pass again and handed it to the attendant. "Seat 2A, the attendant read aloud, her eyes scanning the ticket carefully. She smiled politely and turned to the woman. "Ma'am, this is his seat. Your seat is 3C just behind him." The woman's face turned red, but not from embarrassment. No, it was anger. She stomped her foot slightly, her coat swaying as she leaned forward. "No, you don't understand," she snapped. "He must have switched tickets with someone. I've been flying for years. I know what kind of people sit in first class, and it's not him." The cabin grew tense. A few passengers gasped at her words. Others shook their heads, whispering among themselves. But no one dared to speak up. Everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly, controlling his emotions. He had heard words like that before, people like you. They always stung, but he never allowed them to break his calm. He gave a small, polite smile and looked at the attendant. "Is there still a problem?" he asked softly, his tone gentle but carrying quiet authority. The attendant shook her head firmly. "No, sir. You are in the correct seat." The woman laughed bitterly, her voice full of mockery. "Oh, please. I've seen this kind of thing before. You think you can just dress up, buy a cheap upgrade, and pretend you belong here. I paid good money for my ticket, and I will not sit behind him." She spat the last word like it was poison. Her arrogance filled the cabin like smoke. A man in the seat across the aisle leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable. A young woman pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll but really recording the scene. The moment was too shocking to ignore. Mr. Johnson turned slightly, finally meeting the woman's angry eyes. He didn't glare, he didn't frown. He just looked at her with steady calmness. That calmness seemed to make her even angrier. She wanted a fight, but he refused to give it to her. "Ma'am," the attendant tried again, her voice firmer now. "This seat is not yours. Please take your assigned seat so we can begin boarding the rest of the passengers." The woman shook her head stubbornly. "I'm not moving until this is sorted out. I don't know how he got this seat, but it's not right. People like him." She stopped herself mid-sentence, but everyone already knew what she meant. The silence in the cabin was heavy. Some passengers looked down, ashamed to witness the open disrespect. Others stared directly at the woman, their faces filled with quiet disgust. Mr. Johnson finally shifted in his seat, slowly placing his book on the side table. His voice when he spoke was calm but carried weight. "This is my seat. I am not moving." The firmness in his words surprised even the woman. For the first time she blinked, taken aback. She wasn't expecting resistance delivered with such quiet strength. But pride would not let her back down. She leaned closer again, lowering her voice this time so only he could hear. "You don't fool me," she whispered harshly. "Men like you don't belong here. You don't own anything. You're pretending, and I will make sure everyone knows it." Mr. Johnson studied her for a moment. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of weakness. He had built companies from the ground up, faced boardrooms filled with doubters, and signed contracts worth millions. A loud, bitter voice on an airplane was nothing compared to the storms he had already survived. Passengers around them shifted, whispering again. Some looked ready to call out the woman for her behavior, but Mr. Johnson raised a hand slightly, signaling he didn't need anyone to defend him. He would handle this himself. The flight attendant looked nervous now, glancing toward the front of the plane as if considering calling a supervisor. But Mr. Johnson gave her a reassuring nod. "It's all right," he said quietly. "She'll understand soon." Those words, calm as they were, carried a strange weight, like a promise. The woman scoffed, shaking her head as if she had already won. She didn't know what was coming. The engines outside hummed louder as more passengers boarded, unaware of the storm brewing in the first-class cabin. The white woman sat down angrily in the empty seat beside Mr. Johnson, still muttering under her breath about mistakes and undeserving people. She believed she had embarrassed him, believed she had proven her point. But Mr. Johnson wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't angry. He was simply waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. And when that moment came, the entire plane would never forget it. The plane was almost ready for takeoff. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and luggage compartments. But the tension in the first-class cabin was still heavy, like a storm cloud hanging over everyone's heads. Passengers pretended to read magazines or scroll on their phones, but their ears were tuned to the argument that had just taken place. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The white woman sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. Every few seconds she glanced at Mr. Johnson with eyes full of contempt, as if she couldn't believe he was still there. She whispered under her breath, but loud enough for others to hear. "Unbelievable. In first class. This is a disgrace." Mr. Johnson stayed calm. His face was unreadable, his hands folded neatly on his lap. He had faced louder voices in boardrooms, sharper insults in his early career, and crueler challenges on his way up. He knew better than to waste energy on every storm that passed his way. Still, the open disrespect weighed on him, and it hurt more than he showed. The flight attendant returned one more time, trying again to calm the woman. "Ma'am," she said politely but firmly, "as I explained before, your seat is behind this one. Please let it go so we can prepare for departure." But the woman wasn't ready to stop. She shook her head, her voice sharp and cutting. "No, this is wrong. I don't care what that ticket says. He doesn't belong here. I know what kind of people sit in these seats, and he isn't one of them." The words hung in the air like poison. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper slowly, staring at her in disbelief. A young couple whispered to each other, clearly shocked. But no one spoke out loud. It was as if fear kept their voices trapped inside. Mr. Johnson finally turned his head toward the woman. He didn't raise his voice, but there was power in the way he spoke. "You don't know me," he said calmly. "And yet you've already decided who I am," the woman laughed bitterly. "I don't need to know you. I can see enough. Look at you, sitting here like you own the place. You don't. You're just pretending." Her words were sharp, but her voice was starting to tremble. Deep down, she wasn't as sure of herself as she pretended to be. Still, her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. She wanted to humiliate him, to push him into anger, to make him lose control. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. His silence was stronger than any insult she could throw. The more calm he remained, the more restless she became. Passengers began exchanging looks now. Some shook their heads at her rudeness. Others stared at Mr. Johnson with quiet admiration. They could see his strength, not in loud words, but in the way he refused to let her disrespect break him. The woman, however, mistook his silence for weakness. She smirked and leaned forward again, her voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Go ahead and sit there for now. But once we land, I'll make sure security removes you. You'll see. People like you can't fake their way into first class forever." That sentence, "people like you," pierced the air. Everyone felt the weight of it. Some passengers gasped quietly. The flight attendant froze in place, her face pale as if she didn't know how to respond. Mr. Johnson slowly opened his eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply looked at the woman with a calm, steady gaze that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. "You've said enough," he told her softly. His voice was so calm yet so firm that the entire cabin seemed to pause. The engines roared softly outside, but inside silence stretched for long seconds. The woman scoffed, trying to laugh off the unease she suddenly felt. "Oh, don't act like you're somebody important," she said, her tone mocking. "You don't own this airline. You don't own anything. You're just pretending to be someone you're not." And in that moment, something shifted. It was as if the whole cabin knew, without him saying a word, that she had gone too far. The tension grew so heavy that it seemed the very walls of the plane were listening. Mr. Johnson leaned forward slightly, his calm gaze never leaving hers. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not of arrogance but of certainty. For the first time, the woman blinked nervously. For the first time, her confidence wavered, because deep inside she could sense it. This man was not pretending. There was something different about him, something real, something powerful. But she had no idea just how powerful. She had no idea that the very man she was insulting, the man she believed didn't belong, was the one person on this plane who owned more than a seat. He owned the entire airline, and soon, when he chose to speak the truth, her world would shatter in front of everyone. The cabin lights dimmed as more passengers found their seats. The hum of voices filled the air, but first class was still wrapped in tension. The woman refused to let the matter go. Her face was red, her lips pressed into a tight line, and her body leaned forward as if she were preparing for a fight she couldn't win. She turned sharply toward the flight attendant, her voice rising so everyone could hear. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly. "I paid for my ticket. I don't care what mistake was made, but this man is not supposed to be here. He probably lied his way into first class. How could you let this happen?" The words were sharp, cruel, and heavy with disrespect. People nearby shifted in their seats. Some shook their heads. A businessman in the back of first class whispered "unbelievable" under his breath. A woman across the aisle frowned, watching the scene with disgust. But still, nobody interfered. They were waiting to see how this battle would end. The flight attendant, looking nervous, tried to remain professional. "Ma'am, I have already explained. This gentleman is in the correct seat. Please take your own seat so we can prepare for departure." But the woman refused. She shook her head quickly, almost violently. No. This is unacceptable. I will not sit behind him." Her voice trembled with anger as she pointed directly at Mr. Johnson. "I should not have to sit behind him.
I deserve this seat more than he does." Her words sliced through the cabin like a knife.
It was no longer just about a seat. It was about something deeper, uglier. Everyone could feel it. The passengers' eyes darted back and forth between her and Mr. Johnson, waiting to see if he would finally snap. But Mr. Johnson didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his tie, leaned back slightly, and looked at her with steady eyes. The more calm he was, the more furious she became. His silence was a wall she couldn't break. The woman turned to the passengers around her, throwing her arms in the air. "Can you believe this? This man is pretending to be first class. He doesn't belong here, and they're letting him sit in my seat. This is outrageous." Her voice grew louder, echoing through the cabin. Some passengers looked away, embarrassed for her. Others leaned closer, recording the moment with their phones, knowing they were witnessing something unforgettable. The flight attendant's patience began to crack. Her polite smile faded and her voice grew sharper. "Ma'am, please sit down. If you don't take your seat, we cannot depart. You're holding up the flight." But the woman only laughed bitterly. "Oh, don't you dare tell me what to do," she snapped. "I've flown with this airline for years. I spend thousands of dollars on tickets. And now you're letting him take my seat? This is favoritism. This is discrimination against me." The word discrimination made several passengers gasp. A man in row 3 leaned forward. "Against you," he muttered. But he didn't say it loud enough for her to hear. The woman pressed her hand to her chest, acting as if she were the victim. "I will not be treated this way. When we land, I'll call airport security. They'll drag him out of this seat, and then you'll all see I was right." Her performance was loud, dramatic, and filled with arrogance. She believed she was winning. She believed her voice, her anger, and her pride would make her the victor. But in truth, she was only digging herself into a hole. Mr. Johnson turned his head slowly and looked at her. He still hadn't raised his voice, still hadn't argued. His calmness was unshakable. But behind his quiet eyes, a decision was forming. He knew it was almost time to speak, not yet, but soon. And when he did, the entire cabin would fall silent. Passengers around them began whispering. Some were angry at the woman. Others felt pity for Mr. Johnson, but everyone sensed something important was about to happen. The moment had shifted. The woman's insults were no longer just noise. They were setting the stage for a revelation no one expected. The flight attendant finally crossed her arms, her patience gone. "Ma'am, I will say this one last time. Sit down in your assigned seat. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we may have to remove you from the plane." The woman gasped, as if the very suggestion was an insult. Remove me? Ha! We'll see about that. She looked down at Mr. Johnson again, smirking. Enjoy your little act while it lasts. Because once we land, it's over. The passengers' whispers grew louder now. Phones were recording openly. The woman didn't care. She thought she was right, thought her pride would protect her, but she was wrong. Mr. Johnson finally lifted his glass of water from the tray beside him and took a slow sip. His calmness was unbreakable, and his silence spoke louder than any argument. He placed the glass down gently, looked straight ahead, and waited. Because soon, very soon, the moment would come when he would reveal the truth. And when that truth came out, the entire plane would know that the woman's arrogance had built her own downfall, and her humiliation would be remembered by everyone on that flight. The plane doors finally closed, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, welcoming everyone on board. But inside the first-class cabin, nobody was thinking about the flight. All eyes were still on the white woman and the black man she refused to respect. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her chin raised high as if she were the queen of the cabin. Her anger hadn't cooled down. If anything, it burned hotter. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, muttering under her breath about mistakes and standards. She kept turning toward Mr. Johnson, her eyes filled with fire. Mr. Johnson, however, stayed calm. He leaned back in his seat, one leg crossed over the other, his hands resting lightly on his lap. To anyone watching closely, it was clear. He wasn't ignoring her, he was simply refusing to let her rudeness break his peace. But his silence seemed to make her even more restless, as if she couldn't stand that he wasn't reacting. Finally, she turned to him directly. Her voice was sharp, and this time she didn't bother to lower it. "You're really going to sit there and pretend like you belong?" She snapped. "Do you know how insulting this is? I've spent years working hard to afford seats like this, and now I have to sit beside you." The last word dripped with poison. Several passengers gasped softly. The disrespect was no longer hidden. It was loud, bold, and cruel. The flight attendant, standing nearby, opened her mouth to respond, but Mr. Johnson raised a hand slightly. His gesture was calm, as if to say, "Let her finish." The woman leaned closer, her voice cold and cruel. "People like you don't own anything. You don't build companies. You don't fly first class. You're here by mistake. And when this mistake is corrected, you'll be right where you belong, at the back." Her words cut through the air like a knife. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down, ashamed of what they had just heard. Others shook their heads in disbelief, unable to understand how someone could speak with such open hatred. Mr. Johnson's eyes remained steady. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to, not yet. The power in his silence was stronger than her shouting. The woman smirked, mistaking his silence for defeat. "That's what I thought," she said, leaning back in her seat. "Nothing to say because you know I'm right, but she was wrong. Terribly wrong." Passengers around them began whispering. A man 2 rows back leaned toward his wife and muttered, "She has no idea who she's talking to." The wife nodded, her eyes fixed on Mr. Johnson, sensing that something important was about to happen. The flight attendant cleared her throat and said firmly, "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you continue to harass other passengers, I will have no choice but to call the captain." The woman scoffed loudly, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, call whoever you want. I'll be the one filing a complaint. This whole situation is humiliating for me." She laughed bitterly, her voice echoing in the quiet cabin. But her laughter was shaky, almost forced. Beneath her arrogance, something else was starting to show: fear. Fear that maybe she had gone too far. Fear that maybe the calm man sitting beside her wasn't the easy target she thought he was. Mr. Johnson finally uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. He placed his elbows gently on the armrests, his eyes locked on hers. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, but it carried through the cabin like thunder. "You've spoken enough," he said softly. The entire cabin went silent. Passengers froze in their seats. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter, as if the plane itself was listening. The woman blinked, caught off guard. For the first time since boarding, she didn't have a quick response. Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. Something in his calm gaze made her uncomfortable. She tried to laugh again, but it came out weak. "Oh, and what are you going to do? Tell me you're some big shot? Please, don't make me laugh. You don't own this plane. You don't own this airline. And you certainly don't own a seat like this. You're just pretending." Her words were crueler than ever, her voice dripping with arrogance. She had no idea that every sentence she spoke was bringing her closer to humiliation. Mr. Johnson sat back slowly, his face unreadable. But his eyes carried a fire that no one could miss. The passengers leaned in, holding their breath. They knew it now, the moment was coming. The moment when the calm man would finally reveal who he was. The moment when the woman's pride would shatter like glass. She didn't know it yet, but her cruelest insult had already sealed her fate. And soon, with just a few words, he would turn the entire cabin against her. The air inside the cabin was heavy. Every passenger could feel the weight of the moment. The woman had spoken her cruelest words, certain that she had won. She leaned back in her seat with a smug smile, as if the man beside her had been defeated. She thought her insults had silenced him. But Mr. Johnson was not silent because he was weak. He was silent because he was patient. And now the moment had come. He sat forward slowly, his movements calm and steady. The light above his seat reflected off his suit, giving him an air of quiet power. He rested his hands gently on his knees and looked directly at the woman. His gaze was sharp but not angry. It was the gaze of a man who knew exactly who he was. The cabin grew silent. Even the soft hum of the engine seemed to fade away. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, eyes locked on him. Phones that had been secretly recording now pointed openly, capturing every second. Everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. And then, in a voice calm but full of strength, Mr. Johnson spoke. "Actually," he said, pausing just enough to make the words sink in, "I own this airline." The cabin exploded with shock. Gasps echoed up and down the aisles. A woman in the front covered her mouth with her hands. A man across the aisle whispered, "No way," but his eyes widened when he realized it was true. The passengers who had doubted him only minutes ago now stared at him with awe. The white woman froze. Her smirk disappeared instantly, replaced by disbelief. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if she hadn't heard correctly. What did you say?" She stammered, her voice trembling. Mr. Johnson didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby nervously, straightened up with pride. She gave a small nod, confirming what everyone had just heard. "Yes," she said softly but firmly. "This gentleman is Mr. Johnson, the CEO of this airline." The woman's face turned pale. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Her pride, her arrogance, her insults, all of it collapsed in an instant. She looked around the cabin, searching for support, but all she saw were eyes staring back at her with judgment. Some passengers shook their heads in disgust. Others smirked, enjoying the justice of the moment. A man in the back chuckled softly and whispered to his wife, "She messed with the wrong person." The woman's hands trembled as she gripped the armrests. Her entire body seemed to shrink into the seat. For the first time since she boarded, she was quiet. Mr. Johnson leaned back, his calmness even stronger now. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, didn't rub her humiliation in her face. He simply picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip. The way he carried himself said everything. He didn't need to prove anything more. The silence in the cabin was soon broken by a soft sound. Applause. It started with one passenger, then another, until the entire first-class cabin was clapping. The applause wasn't loud or rowdy, it was steady, respectful. It was the kind of applause given not for a performance, but for dignity and strength. The woman sat frozen, her face burning with shame. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the seat and vanish, but there was no escape. She had insulted the very man who owned the plane she sat in, and now the entire cabin knew it. The flight attendant leaned closer to her and said quietly, "Please, ma'am, take your seat. We need to prepare for takeoff." Her voice carried no sympathy, only firmness. The woman nodded quickly, her arrogance gone. She stood up, nearly stumbling, and hurried to her assigned seat behind him. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her head lowered in shame. Passengers watched her pass by, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the justice of it all. When she finally sat down, the cabin felt lighter. The tension that had filled the air had been replaced with something else, respect. Respect for the man who had handled cruelty with calmness, who had turned humiliation into victory without ever raising his voice. Mr. Johnson closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He didn't enjoy embarrassing people. But he knew some lessons could only be learned this way. He hadn't wanted to reveal his identity, but the woman's cruelty left him no choice. Now the truth was out. And the silence of the woman behind him was proof enough that the message had been received. Passengers whispered quietly, their voices filled with awe. "That's him," one man said. "That's the owner. I read about him in the news." Another woman nodded, smiling. He handled it perfectly. No shouting, no anger, just truth. The captain's voice returned on the speakers, reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. But for many on that plane, the flight was no longer just a trip. It had become a story they would never forget. And in the middle of it all sat Mr. Johnson, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. He opened his book again, turned a page, and began to read. To him, it was just another flight. But for the passengers, and especially for the woman now sitting silently in shame, it was a lesson. A lesson that respect costs nothing and arrogance can cost everything. The sound of applause still echoed in the cabin. It wasn't wild or noisy. It was slow, steady, and full of respect. Passengers looked at Mr. Johnson with admiration, their eyes shining with pride for the way he had handled the ugly situation. For many, it felt like justice had been served right in front of them. Mr. Johnson didn't smile or nod to the applause. He didn't need to. He simply closed his book gently, placed it on the tray beside him, and leaned back in his seat with quiet dignity. His calmness made the moment even more powerful. The woman, however, sat frozen in her seat behind him. Just minutes ago, her voice had filled the cabin with insults. Now her silence was louder than her shouting had ever been. Her face burned red, and she avoided looking at anyone. She shrank into her chair, wishing she could disappear. Every clap of applause felt like a reminder of her mistake, echoing in her ears, breaking down the wall of arrogance she had built. Passengers exchanged whispers. A man leaned toward his wife and said softly, "He could have humiliated her with anger, but he didn't. He just told the truth. That's real strength." His wife nodded in agreement, her eyes still locked on Mr. Johnson. A young woman who had been recording the scene on her phone whispered, "The world needs to see this. People need to know how he handled it." She saved the video carefully, her heart racing with excitement. The flight attendant walked down the aisle, her shoulders straighter now, her steps lighter. She looked at Mr. Johnson with respect and gratitude. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said quietly, but her voice carried. Passengers nearby heard it and nodded in agreement. They knew what she meant. They knew it took great patience to sit through such disrespect without losing control. Meanwhile, the woman's pride was broken. She clenched her fists on her lap, but her body trembled. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to take back the words she had thrown at him. But she couldn't. The truth was too strong. Her humiliation was complete. She leaned back, staring out the window, her eyes unfocused. Her thoughts raced. How could I have been so foolish? Why didn't I keep my mouth shut? Why did I assume? But it was too late. The damage was done. Mr. Johnson reached for his drink, lifting the glass with steady hands. He took a slow sip, set it back down, and then closed his eyes as if none of this mattered anymore. To him, the matter was over. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth had spoken for itself. The passengers admired that. They could see he wasn't just a powerful man, he was a disciplined man. He had power, but he also had control. That combination inspired everyone who witnessed it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the mood inside the cabin had completely changed. The passengers who had felt tense and uneasy earlier now felt proud to be in the presence of someone like him. They knew they would remember this flight forever. The woman shifted in her seat, still restless, still ashamed. Every time she glanced up, she saw passengers looking at her, their expressions clear: disappointment, judgment, even pity. She lowered her gaze again, wishing the flight would end quickly. When the plane lifted into the sky, Mr. Johnson opened his book once more and began to read. His calmness made it look as if nothing had happened at all. But to the others, everything had changed. They had witnessed something powerful, a moment when arrogance tried to humiliate dignity, but dignity stood taller. A little boy sitting with his parents in first class tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "is he really the owner of the whole airline?" His mother smiled gently and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. And he's teaching everyone here a very big lesson." The boy looked at Mr. Johnson with wide eyes. admiration glowing in his face. It was the kind of moment that would stay with him for years, shaping the way he saw the world. In the back of the cabin, whispers continued. Some passengers smiled quietly to themselves. Others wrote messages on their phones, eager to tell friends and family about what they had just seen. It was more than just a flight. It was a story of strength, patience, and truth. The woman sat silently, her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. Her thoughts replayed the moment again and again, the way the cabin gasped, the way her arrogance turned into shame, the way Mr. Johnson had revealed the truth without anger. She realized that no excuse could save her from the humiliation she had brought upon herself. For Mr. Johnson, however, the moment was not about her humiliation. It was about something bigger. It was about showing that dignity cannot be stolen, that respect cannot be forced, and that truth always wins in the end. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, passengers settled into their seats. Some watched movies, others closed their eyes to rest. But in the quiet of their hearts, they carried the memory of what had just happened. And in that cabin, in that moment, Mr. Johnson was not just a CEO, not just the owner of an airline. He was a symbol of something greater: calm strength, unshakable dignity, and the power of truth. The plane flew smoothly through the clouds, the sky outside painted in soft shades of orange and gold. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The tension, the whispers, the anger, all of it was gone. Now there was silence, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was a silence of reflection, of thought. Every passenger carried the memory of what had just unfolded, a memory they knew they would never forget. Mr. Johnson sat calmly in his seat, his book open once again. He read a few lines, then paused, looking out the window at the endless sky. His face was peaceful, but inside he was thinking. He never enjoyed moments like this. He didn't like embarrassing people, even when they had insulted him. But he also knew that sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes the truth needed to be spoken, not for himself, but for the lesson it could give to others. Behind him, the woman who had insulted him sat like a shadow of her former self. Her arms were no longer crossed, her chin no longer raised. She kept her head down, staring at her hands, replaying every word she had said. Her pride was broken. For the first time in a long time, she was forced to face herself. She thought she had known who belonged in first class, who deserved respect, who carried power. But she had been wrong. Completely, humiliatingly wrong. Passengers around her whispered quietly, but their voices carried lessons too. "You never know who you're talking to," one man said softly. "Respect costs nothing, but it can change everything." A woman nodded in agreement. Yes, that man could have destroyed her with anger, but instead he showed patience. That's real strength. Farther up in the cabin, the little boy who had asked about Mr. Johnson earlier leaned against his mother's shoulder. "Mom," he whispered again, he was so calm. Even when she was mean. "Why didn't he shout at her?" His mother smiled and stroked his hair. "Because shouting doesn't always win, my love. Sometimes the strongest voice is the quiet one." The boy nodded slowly, his young mind absorbing the lesson. For him, this flight would not just be a memory. It would be a guide for how to treat others in his future. As the hours passed, the story settled into the hearts of everyone present. Some wrote messages to friends, eager to share what they had seen. Others sat quietly, reflecting on their own lives, wondering if they had ever judged someone unfairly or spoken without thinking. The woman's arrogance had been ugly, but it had also been a mirror, showing everyone how easy it was to assume, to disrespect, to let pride lead the way. When the plane finally began its descent, the captain's voice filled the cabin, reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. But for most passengers, their minds were still on the moment when the truth had been spoken. "I own this airline." The landing was smooth. The wheels touched the ground, and the cabin filled with the familiar sound of brakes and engines slowing down. Passengers reached for their bags, but their eyes kept glancing at Mr. Johnson. Some wanted to thank him, but his calm presence made them hesitate. It felt as if disturbing him would break the dignity of the moment. The woman remained quiet. She didn't rush to leave the plane as she had rushed to insult him. Instead, she waited, her face pale, her pride gone. The walk of shame she would take out of the cabin weighed on her shoulders like a heavy stone. When the doors opened and passengers began to leave, some stopped briefly beside Mr. Johnson's seat. A man gave a respectful nod. A woman whispered, "Thank you." A young couple smiled warmly at him. They weren't thanking him for owning the airline. They were thanking him for showing them something far more important: grace under fire. Mr. Johnson acknowledged them with a small nod. Nothing more. He didn't need applause, didn't need praise. The lesson had already been given. The woman finally rose from her seat. She avoided looking at anyone, her eyes glued to the floor as she walked quickly down the aisle. Her steps were heavy, almost clumsy, as if the weight of her own actions pressed down on her legs. Passengers turned their heads to watch her leave, some with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. Mr. Johnson remained seated until the cabin was nearly empty. Then he stood, collected his bag, and walked out calmly, his head held high. The flight attendants straightened their uniforms as he passed, nodding with deep respect. They knew who he was, but more than that, they knew what he represented. Outside, as he walked through the jet bridge, a young man who had been in first class caught up to him. Nervously, he said, "Sir, I just want to say, the way you handled that, it was incredible. I'll never forget it." Mr. Johnson gave a faint smile. "Remember this," he said gently. "Respect is free, but it's priceless. Never forget that." The young man nodded, the words settling deep in his heart. And just like that, Mr. Johnson walked on, disappearing into the busy airport crowd. To many, he was just another traveler in a suit. But to those who had been on that flight, he was unforgettable. They would tell the story again and again, about the woman who tried to take a seat that wasn't hers, about the man who faced disrespect with calmness, and about the moment when arrogance froze at the truth: "I own this airline." For the woman, the memory would be a scar. For the passengers, it would be a lesson. And for the world, once the story spread, it would become a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen, that truth always rises, and that respect, simple, quiet respect, is the greatest seat anyone can hold.